Well, welcome everybody to our distinguished lecture series. My name is Jeff McDonald, and on behalf of Jay Famiglietti, who directs our Global Institute for Water Security, and John Pomeroy, who leads the Global Water Futures Project, and who collectively underwrite this seminar series, I'd like to welcome you all to this week's event. Before we get going, I want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Métis, and we pay our respects to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And today is a real pleasure to welcome Cathy Wilson from Los Alamos National Lab. Cathy is a senior scientist there and has been at Los Alamos since, I think, 1999. It's funny, in the chat before the talk started, Cathy and I knew each other well, in another life. I think, Cathy, you've gone on to much bigger and better things, but at one point we finished our PhDs probably within a year of each other, both kind of looking at similar Hillslope hydrology, geomorphology processes. And after her PhD at UC Berkeley with Bill Dietrich, she went on to work at CSIRO in Australia for a decade or so. But since then, she's really morphed into a global thought leader in Arctic processes and how to represent hydrological, geomorphological understanding into Arctic processes and Earth system science models. As I said, she's a senior scientist at Los Alamos, and she's a member of the International Arctic Science Committee. She's president-elect of the U.S. Permafrost Association, and has received a number of awards through her career, including a recent one, a Research and Development 100 award from U.S. Department of Energy. So it's with great pleasure to welcome Cathy to us and to introduce her talk today. And I think, Cathy, you're going to now share slides, or Don or Terry will make that magically happen. But thanks so much again.
Okay, well, I just thank you so much, Jeff, for that great introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I wish I could be with you all in person. Hopefully my slides are up, maybe a nod, Jeff. Okay, great. And so I'll go ahead and jump right in. Today I'm going to talk about how at least the Department of Energy and a group of collaborators, national labs and collaborators, are working toward the next generation of Arctic land models. And I want to just say right up front that while my name is on that front slide, really the talk reflects the work of a very large group of researchers. This work is primarily funded by a project called the Next Generation Ecosystem Experiment Arctic, as well as the E3SM Energy Exascale Earth System Modeling Projects at the U.S. Department of Energy. And I want to thank in particular Stan Woolschlager, who's the PI of this project, and Peter Thornton, who's the modeling lead on the project. They're both at Oak Ridge National Lab. Steve Price, who is the E3SM lead at Los Alamos National Lab, and Bob Bolton, who works very closely with me. He's at University of Alaska Fairbanks in leading a portion of the NGEE Arctic project that I'll be focused on today. So first I'm going to set the scene. And I know many of you are familiar with climate science, but I'll kind of quickly go through the basics here. We know through measurements that the Earth is warming, both the atmosphere and the ocean, and based on modeling, we can project that the Earth will continue to warm into the future. And here we're looking at just some of the observed changes in Earth temperature that occurred over the period of 1901 to 2012. Some places in the non-high latitude regions changing by as much as a couple of degrees C over that time period. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, oops. Yeah, I'm having some issues here with lag. I'll try to correct my pace. And we also know from measurements that the Arctic itself is getting hotter, and it's getting hotter faster. And in fact, if we look at the change in temperature, mean annual temperature in the Arctic between 1960 and 2019, we see that there's up to almost 5 degrees Celsius of change in the very high Arctic, and between 2 and 4 degrees in the Arctic in general. And in fact, you know, some records, at least in terms of when we've been measuring, suggest that some temperatures are as hot as they've ever gotten, like 100 degrees recently in towns in Siberia. And we know that understanding and predicting change in the Arctic is both locally and globally important. It's a unique place with you know, remarkable ecosystems and wildlife, both in the oceans, on the land, and on the ice, or all three of those. Very rich in mineral and oil resources. Is uniquely positioned in terms of politics and national security, where you know, major nations of the U.S., Canada, Russia, Europe, European nations are in very close proximity to one another across a small ocean, the Arctic Ocean. And of course, it is the homeland of people and cultures that are rich with knowledge and heritage that depends on the ice that is critical to what makes up the Arctic. When we think about change in the Arctic, you know, the main things that come to mind often is the loss of summer sea ice. Over the past 42 years, 2020 summer was the lowest, second lowest in the 42-year satellite record. And of course, with this comes loss of critical habitat, changes in the characteristics of the ocean that is, you know, resulting in changing species of fish, etc. And then also increased commercial activity, energy development, tourism, etc. So kind of they're what we might call winners and losers in this reduction in sea ice coverage. But also, obviously, when we think about kind of ice as just ice, you know, the Greenland ice sheet melting is another thing that is, of course, great concern due to its impact on sea level rise. So lots of things happening up there. But we know that it's not, you know, it's not just about sea ice and ice sheets. It's also about the permafrost. And 24% of the Northern Hemisphere landmass is permafrost. That's shown in the bluer regions on the right-hand image. And I'm sure most of you know, but I'll just go ahead and say that permafrost is ground that's been frozen year-round for 2 or more years. Of course, most permafrost has been frozen for hundreds or thousands of years. So it's been around a long time, and this frozen landscape has unique characteristics because of it. Now, when permafrost thaws, the ice in the ground melts, and this can often lead to ground collapse. So really shifting, changing morphology of the land surface and organization of the landscape. On the left-hand side, you see a piece of a core from permafrost. If you're not familiar with what it looks like, the darker bands in that core are ice, and it props up the soil column. And so you can see in the right-hand graphic that as the ice between those grains of soil melts, really there's nothing to prop up the soil, and that's what drives this subsidence. And so there's a lot of local impacts to ecosystems, food security, and infrastructure associated with that, from housing collapsing, roads collapsing, pipelines being, oil and gas pipelines being undermined, previously drier landscapes becoming boggy, infrastructure collapse like the Norrell's chemical tank collapse that sent a large spill down an Arctic river, and landslides. But there are also obviously global impacts. And so for tens of thousands of years, permafrost has been a sink for the Earth's atmospheric carbon. And what we're looking at on the in the right-hand graphic is the intensity, or the amount of carbon in kilograms per square meter of surface area throughout the Pan-Arctic region, where the orangey areas are areas where the concentration of organic carbon in the top 3 meters of soil is really, really high. And many of you are familiar with, say, peatland soils and the peatlands of Canada, which are a huge carbon store, organic carbon store. And if you look at the panel on the left, basically permafrost contains around 16,000 gigatons of carbon, of this organic carbon, which is likely to be more than the rest of the carbon in soils on the Earth, more than the rest of the plants on Earth. And, you know, it's getting up there with our fossil fuel reserves. And so there's this great concern that as permafrost thaws and this carbon, organic carbon, is made available for decomposition, that it could in fact drive large release of CO2 and methane into the atmosphere. So permafrost is thawing, and it will thaw even faster over the next 50 years. And the big concern in the permafrost community is that this sink is now going to become a source. And again, looking at the right-hand figure, permafrost, the current permafrost boundary is the dark solid blue line. And as by the 2080 timeframe, that's now, you know, only 60 years from now, it's likely to have contracted that region in which there is frozen ground that is above, like within the top 3 meters of the ground surface, will change dramatically, will shrink dramatically. Okay, so one of the big questions that is posed by the community is how much frozen carbon will be released, how fast and what form, CO2 or methane, and then of course, how will this impact the rest of the Earth's climate system if the Arctic can in fact pump that much carbon and methane and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so the community uses modeling to understand the future. And so now I'm going to shift to discussing, you know, where we're at with, you know, how do we look into the future? And what we use, and we've been using for decades, are these complex coupled models called Earth system models. I'm going to refer to them as ESMs. And they compute the land, atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, and land ice interactions that occur in the whole of the global system to project the future states of the Earth. And I'm on the left-hand image, I'm showing one of the earlier, a graphic of an earlier version of an Earth system model. Basically, it's you grid up the Earth and you apply physics to the different components of the Earth, with the atmosphere physics on the outside, ocean on that outer rim, ocean and land and ice processes on that inner circle, and the various physics that are computed on these numerical meshes using high performance computing are then coupled and interact with each other, typically nowadays on very short time frames, say maybe every 15 minutes or less. The atmosphere talks to the land, and the land talks to the ocean, and the ocean talks to the land, and the ocean talks to the atmosphere. And you know, that was the last generation of model. The next generation of models, and in particular, I'm showing you on the right-hand side an image of ocean current velocities that are being produced by the very high resolution, very much higher fidelity physics-based ocean model in the DOE's E3SM model. And really what the DOE is doing is trying to remake what the future of Earth system models looks like by improving the fidelity of the physics and changing the actual structure and formulation of the model itself, including the numerical meshes that all of the equations and physics are built on, to be able to really capture what's going on the Earth's surface, to have the best possible projections into the future. So these Earth system models are first tested against historical data sets and then run forward into the future, forced by different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And so what does that mean? Well, they had in the last round of these simulations that were done with all the major international global climate models, they ran scenarios that ranged from a representative carbon pathway 2.6, where all the countries decide to have very stringent emission controls to try to limit how much global temperature will change. And on the red end of the spectrum here, this RCP 8.5 represents more business as usual. If we don't really start to rein in our use of fossil fuels and the emissions from fossil fuels, it will lead to very high, much higher temperatures. And if we look at the right-hand panel figure, we can use these models, especially the group of models that have high quality permafrost representation, permafrost physics representation, to look at how permafrost will change over time. And so what we're looking at here is the solid lines are the mean of a whole range of different models that are run. Those models have a spread in them between one that might give you one prediction versus another that gives you is built slightly differently and gives you a different prediction. And where the red one is this RCP8 and how much reduction in the area of permafrost that will occur by the end of the century, depending on what we do in terms of emissions. And those are the coupled global climate models that can do that. And in the last generation of those models, they didn't really have the carbon cycle appropriately linked in, but there are these kind of what we call offline models, or just land-focused models, and that can be run across the Pan-Arctic region. And a couple of those are Sipkasa and Jules. And when those models are run many, many times with different sets of values for, say, how much plants photosynthesize and how much carbon can be decomposed, there's this really high variation in the models in terms of the amount of emissions that will come out of that thawing permafrost between now and even 2100, the end of this century. But certainly that uncertainty really grows as we look out an additional century or so. So lots of uncertainty in understanding how the Earth is going to behave, how permafrost is going to behave, and what it will mean for the Earth's whole global climate system. So what are we at DOE and we in the NGEE Arctic project doing to improve Arctic land models, these representations that will allow us to get at that answer? I mentioned earlier that DOE is investing over a decade period a huge amount of money on rebuilding a global climate model that can run on the latest high performance computing, or even the next generation called exascale computers. In several generations ago, high performance computing could do many computations at once on many cores. Then there were teraflop computers, then petaflop computers, and now we're building to heading towards these exascale computing. And what that allows us to do is not only get more complicated in our representations of the physics in all of the components, the ocean, the land, the atmosphere, it also allows us to get much higher resolution. So if you look at the bottom right panel, the new DOE model runs on these unstructured multi-scale meshes, where in areas that we need more information, we need to more finely resolve what's happening, say along coastlines or in particularly vulnerable areas of the Earth, we can really improve the resolution of the numerical meshes that the models are run on. And these big computers, exascale computers, can handle that extra load of the higher resolution, higher resolution. And in addition to kind of changing the whole structure and formulation that enables, really getting at how the Earth works, DOE is focused on also improving the equations and representations of the atmosphere, cryosphere, ocean, and land and energy balance. And so as part of that, let's see. Okay, the next generation Arctic ecosystem experiment, let's see, aims at improving the land model, and in particular to reduce that uncertainty I mentioned before. And it is a $10 million a year project meant to run for a decade. We're in the 8th year. It's probably going to run a little longer because of COVID. And it is a collaboration led out of Oak Ridge National Lab, a collaboration between 4 national labs and the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. And its approach is to develop the basic understanding and knowledge of the various processes that drive the carbon cycle and water cycle, and understand the coupling and interactions between the biological, chemical, and landscape processes that determine the whole system behavior. And in the figure on the right, kind of a key, and this is modified from a Ted Scher paper that published a number of years ago. We need to be able to get really understand how the system works in terms of what's going to dominate. As the Arctic system, Arctic tundra systems warm, plants may become more productive and suck more CO2 and methane out of the atmosphere to use that carbon through photosynthesis and into the soil column in these Arctic landscapes. And that's great. That would help continue this sink. But we also know that as permafrost thaws deeper into the soil column or ground, that this really rich store of permafrost carbon can be thawed, and as that's decomposed, it can be emitted. So getting at this balance between photosynthesis and uptake and the biogeochemical and microbial and processes that drive the outgassing is what we're really about. The first step then was figuring out what the key land model deficiencies are. And really we, after a lot of lit reviews, engagement with the broader community, workshops, etc., 4 kind of key things came out that we felt that this project could work with. Poor representation of the landscape complexity that sits within each of those grid cells in a land model. Poor understanding and representation of Arctic plant traits. The last generation of Earth system models used grasses and shrubs from temperate regions to represent Arctic plants. And we know from our measurements, that the community measurements, that that's just not right. Outright missing biogeochemical processes that drive soil carbon decomposition, and missing hydrologic processes, especially dynamic inundation in wetland areas, snow redistribution, and controls on hillslope runoff pathways. And it takes a big team of people to do this, and a strong interaction between the modelers, observationalists, and experimentalists to make it happen. But I certainly can't, in the time remaining, go over all of those. And this is a water security series, so I'm going to focus on the hydrology. And this is the area that I co-lead across the NGEE Arctic project with Bob Bolton at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we focus our research around big science questions. And our science question is, where, when, and why will the Arctic get wetter or drier? And if we look at projections from these permafrost-enabled models of wetting or drying in the Arctic into the future, say in 2100, the different models, when they're compared to one another, give not only very big differences, different results in terms of the timing of changing of soil moisture in the Arctic, but also the spatial extent, as we see here on the right. Each model, some models like Orchidee saying things are going to dry up a lot. That's all this red stuff. Whereas models like COLM saying no, things are actually going to get a lot wetter. And yes, there will be, it is projected that there'll be more rain, but the fact that permafrost is thawing, Orchidee says, well, my model takes into account more that the bucket's going to get bigger and water will drop down to the bottom of the bucket than this model. So there are reasons why these are different, but we need to figure out, what's best. So we focused on kind of 2 end members or highly contrasting areas of an ecoclimatic gradient. Our first site was up in Utqiagvik in the Barrow Peninsula. Our second site is in the Seward Peninsula, lowland wet tundra environment, cold wet tundra in Utqiagvik, and hilly continuous to discontinuous permafrost environment, so warmer environment in the Seward Peninsula, more degraded from a permafrost perspective. And as I mentioned before, or maybe I didn't mention, but basically the evolution of permafrost hydrology really underpins ecosystem function. What the plants are going to do, how productive they'll be, which species will dominate, and how the microbes will behave that decompose carbon is going to depend on how wet or how dry the landscape is. In these cold ecosystems, cold lowland ecosystems, the landscape is often characterized by these ice wedge polygon networks that form these inundated ponds. As the tops of the ice wedges gradually melt out or even rapidly melt out over time, these ridges that rims that form these wetland landscapes can collapse and move toward these high center polygons with interconnected troughs that can be drained. And that shifts whether you're going to have an anoxic environment that's more methane producing versus here in the wet areas versus a drier, more oxic environment that may be have very little methane but strongly CO2 producing. And this role of the evolution of permafrost and what it does in terms of the hydrology is, both applies to these cold lowland systems, but also these warmer upland systems where permafrost, when it's continuous on the left-hand side of this figure, really can prop up the hydrologic system such that, rain comes in, rain ponds, rain runs off in the near surface zone with maybe moisture soils and vegetation that reflects that. And it can't really drain deeply into the bedrock or shallow bedrock groundwater systems. Whereas as it degrades, if we look at the right-hand side of the figure, the hydrology can shift dramatically, maybe, again, infiltrating more, maybe drying out those soils, maybe encouraging different species to take off and be more dominant, perhaps more shrubs than tussock tundra, and also encourage deeper pathways through the holes in the permafrost, or what we call through talc, through fractures, changing and back out to streams and lakes, that changes the geochemistry of the water in the streams, the temperature of the water in the streams, maybe the other water quality characteristics, certainly the flow patterns in winter and in summer. So our inundation, one of our key, so we have three things that we're working on to improve the models in the hydrology question, the where, when, and why will the Arctic get wetter and drier. The first is inundation dynamics in these cold lowland landscapes. These landscapes that are characterized on the right by these big oval drain thaw lake basins, and here they're colorized by age when when they were thought to have been last drained, with the yellow ones being more recently drained, and the red ones having probably drained and over, well, between 300 and 2,000 years ago. And throughout this landscape are these ice wedge polygons that have different shapes and characteristics. And if we look at the right, as I mentioned before, in the spring, these ice wedge polygons are flooded. As we advance into the summer, some of this water, or a lot of the water, drains either through troughs or actually through subsurface lateral flow. Some is evaporated, most is also evaporated or transpired. And these topographies have this micro topography on the order of just a meter or so, has this dramatic impact on the type of vegetation that grows in the flooded areas versus the higher rims, and also the biogeochemical processes that occur. And so we instrumented across a range of different types of these ice wedge polygon land units, so we could start to get a handle on how does the structure of the landscape control the distribution of the water in the landscape, and then pass that information on to our vegetation people and biogeochemists, so that they can use our hydrologic information to help inform the processes that they're observing at these same sites. Now, at the same time that we were developing networks of networks of observations in the field, Los Alamos National Lab recognized that we really needed to build a new high fidelity multi-physics model that enabled us to explore these systems in all their complexity in 3 dimensions. Most Arctic hydrology, thermal hydrology models 8 years ago, not all, but many or most, were these 1D column-based models. Still very, very useful. Many of them are still highly, they enable us to scale up, so critical in our repertoire. But we really wanted to understand these interactions between snow, temperature, standing water, thermal temperatures in the subsurface, runoff temperatures, and the infected heat from runoff, the whole range of things and how they interact, in order to figure out then, once we feel like we really understand the system, maybe we can simplify it again to put into our Earth system models, or add additional physics to the Earth system models that we feel is missing and have to be there in order to get the answer right. This could be a talk in itself. I can't possibly go through what the ATS, the Advanced Terrestrial Simulator, does. So I'm going to move on. I do have colleagues who would be able to give you more information on that. And as I said, once NGEE Arctic ramped up, we started measuring the critical variables, including, transects of ground temperature and soil moisture and water levels across these different polygon types, the high centered, the low centered, transitional flat ones, etc. Carried out snow surveys and hydraulic conductivity measurements and thermal conductivity measurements, etc. That we then use to test with this to test the ATS model and then run the ATS model when we felt confident in it, to start trying to get a handle on what we expected. First, does it represent the dynamic inundation behavior that we were observing, but then also so that we could project into the future what that would be. And so basically what we're looking at here are in the upper right are some of our inundation ponded depth simulations, the red areas being dry and the blue areas having ponded water of a certain depth, and the surface temperatures of the ground associated with that. Okay, let's see. So, but that's fine, but how do we do this at the scale of a land model grid cell? And so a grid cell, in this case, it might be something like, even if it's, when it's very high resolution grid cell, like this 10 by 10 kilometer grid cell shown here, or, you know, synthetic grid cell, there's a lot of complexity in there. And so the land model in E3SM has added, has kind of modified the way that it treats these grid cells to enable us to get more of this complexity built in, where you can give it, you can say that this cell has percentages or distributions of different properties that you then do computations on independently. So we might, this whole grid cell may be in the topographic unit of lowland. It then might have these land units in it that might include, you know, the lakes and streams, but also land units called ice wedge polygons. And then those ice wedge polygons, the percentage of the land that is made up of those will have percentages of low, high, flat center polygons. And so our role as is to then, and what we've been working on is providing the parameterizations that can feed into this framework for representing the heterogeneity in this grid cell, rather than just saying it's all one thing, one flat piece of ground. And we've done that by building some simplified versions of the behavior that we were able to predict using the ATS, using these an analytic model of polygon fill and drainage, and then building classifiers using machine learning techniques that allow us to, if you look in the upper left-hand side, allow us to very quickly from remote sensing classify the percentages and types of polygons across large pieces of the landscape. And then running this model many times, we can develop behaviors that we can then get runoff parameters from that can go into these different classes that feed into the land model. Now I'm going to move on to the snow redistribution and hillslope hydrology in the last portion of my talk. Oh, and I should have said on that last slide, we actually now are working with our colleagues at Oak Ridge, testing that analytic model using these distributions of ice wedge polygons and other characteristics, other landscape classes in the ELM grid cell framework to see how well it behaves in relation to measurements up in the field of runoff. So we're pretty excited about that we've actually gotten to that point with the inundation dynamics. So moving on to snow redistribution and hillslope hydrology. These are the other two things that surprisingly have been missing in the last generation of these coupled land models. Many land models, including the land models that are developed and run out of your institution by John and his colleagues, do have very sophisticated snow redistribution models or snow redistribution. And we're actually working on building a collaboration with your team in order to take this to the next step. But I'm going to show you where we've started and why we've started here. I mentioned that you know, we're looking at running this coupled model of the atmosphere, ocean, land, sea ice, ice sheets, all running together at the same time at very high resolutions for the whole globe in E3SM. we have to be very thoughtful about simplifying the physics where we can, and in order for those models to run and not take many years, actually real years, to run real years of computational, real years of, or sorry, I should say simulated years of the Earth evolution. They are really computationally intensive. So our approach was to start our snow redistribution work by using more, taking a more geographical, statistical approach to what might control the redistribution of snow in the landscape. So in the Seward Peninsula, which is our warmer, hillier environment that we're working on, there are kind of 3 sites that we work at there in the NGEE Arctic project. But for the snow work, we mainly work at 2 sites, one on the Teller Road, the red dot in the left panel on the Teller Road, and the red dot on the left figure on the Cougarock Road. And these have very strongly contrasting climate, topography, vegetation, and permafrost. The Cougarock site is colder and more continuous permafrost. The Teller site is discontinuous permafrost. And so on the right-hand side, you can see that you know, the Cougarock is this kind of peaky, cone-shaped watershed or area that we're looking at, and Teller is more like a standard watershed where with an outlet of a stream at the bottom of the figure and a stream running up the middle of the watershed, both of these watersheds are characterized as shrub tundra, Teller with a lot of tall willow shrubs, and Cougarock with a lot of tall alder shrubs. And okay, so, oh, missed one. All right. So again, another large team effort. The modeling is a huge team effort. The snow work is a huge team effort. While Bob Bolden and I used to lead it, now I've handed this over to Katrina Bennett, who is a Canadian and went to school at UAF, PhD, but also worked at PECIC in Canada for quite a while doing snow hydrology work. So we over the past 4 years have collected thousands of snow depths and hundreds of snow property data points in situ, and these range from using what we call a magna probe that you stick in the ground, push a button, and it records your depth of snow and your your GPS, where you are in space, as well as the snow water equivalent. If you look at the tube on the lower left-hand side, Bob Bolden is dumping snow into a big bag that has been extracted out of the snow column that we then weigh, and that tells us then how much water is actually held in a column of snow of a given depth. And so over the 4 years that we've been collecting data, and now we're looking at the Teller site, we've collected, we can start looking at then how the distribution of snow depth varies in space and in time. So the lower left, we're looking at kind of bars, the heights of the bars and the colors of the bars in the Teller watershed represent the depth of the snow in this 2018 Teller Snow Depth Survey, or Teller Snow Survey, where the orange and yellow values are, quite deep snow, up to 2 meters, in some cases, 2.5 meters deep in this particular year. And the pink and white and blue being a little bit lower snow. And this is we do these snow surveys at the end of the snow season. And for the most part, based on our other measurements, recording snow measurements throughout the winter, we have a pretty good sense that this is when we have the deepest snowpack before it's starting to melt. And so then if we look on the right-hand side, it gives you a sense of kind of the average of the snow depth in the blue dots, the darker blue being, the bigger darker blue being, you know, on average over this time period, snow is deeper in these areas. The red stars are where we sampled the snow water equivalent. And then we also had a number of snow pits where we looked at the depth, density versus depth, or snow characteristics as a function of depth. And this data is still being, but we've also already run a series of analyses with related landscape data, topography, vegetation, you know, in situ wind and solar radiation data to try to figure out what are the key factors. If we have to have a very simple model, what are the key things that year to year to year control where the deep snow is going to be versus the shallow snow? And so just to give you a sense of kind of what this looks, you know, what these variables look like across this particular watershed, and they look different in Utqiagvik, but this is just showing you Teller right now. You know, we look at local elevation, variation, aspect, slope, vegetation type, NDVI, which is I guess we can use it here, fortunately, as a value that is helps us kind of as a surrogate for vegetation and other topographic characteristics like how convex or concave or curvature. We also looked at shrub density and shrub height. And to get that shrub density and height data, we used an unmanned aerial lidar system that gave us super high resolution information about the spatial patterns and spatial height of the canopy and density of the canopy throughout this watershed. And that just kind of a projection of some of that canopy data is shown in this kind of greenish color on the right. And as with, you know, many snow surveys and many reported in the literature, and as many models have shown, deeper, where there are taller shrubs and more dense shrubs, you're likely to get deeper snow. But of course, other things matter: topography, slope, elevation, exposure, etc. So I'm going to take a quick break here to let you and show you a movie of our unmanned aerial system in flight during the summer or late fall, and kind of walk you through how this laser system works. So this movie was made by a postdoc of mine, Christian Anderson. He's now an assistant professor at University of Wisconsin in Madison. And we're flying over the route out to the Seward Teller site. We call it the Seward Teller 27 site. And this gives you a kind of a good sense of what the landscape and watershed looks. We're flying down the stream, and you can see that the shrubs are really quite thick across many parts of the landscape. And so we use the LiDAR to really get a handle on the high resolution topography, both of the shrub canopy itself, but also under the canopy and throughout the rest of the watershed. There's quite a bit of work in deploying the instrumentation that's required for doing high precision high resolution laser altimetry. Here we're flying it on a heavy lift UAV. We now have a better, more heavy lift one. It worked fine in colder, low elevation landscapes, but one hot day in New Mexico, it just didn't have the lift at our high elevation and in our heat to maintain its flight pattern. So we ended up having to get a new one. This gives you a sense of what the data looks like. And after each flight, and you have to fly the watershed in pieces, we make sure that the instrument has collected the data properly. The red here is low elevation, the blue is high elevation. You can really see the shrubs and the ground surface below the shrubs emerge in this type of data with up to 800 points of elevation points per square meter. So this is super high resolution. And I think we're pretty much done. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. All right, so using these kind of topographic and vegetation variables with machine learning based statistical models, we have been able to do a very good job of, I'll call it prediction in quotation marks, predicting the snow redistribution at the end of the winter for each winter snow period. We have a lot more work to do. This is just 2 catchments. We're going to be working with the NASA Above and SNOWX projects to do a joint campaign across a big swath. And as I said, we're looking to collaborate with John and others on improving this. And again, the reason we like this approach is that it enables us to fit a simple snow redistribution model scheme into the ELM's subgrid hierarchy. Oh, I didn't know the time has flown. Okay, I'm going to just then quickly say in closing that using our snow data, we've been able to, and our ATS model, we've been able to start predicting how hill slopes will behave as shrubs increase in Arctic landscapes and how that will change hydrology from these surface pathways to subsurface pathways. And in particular, start investigating it at the watershed scale, where we can now start predicting actual big patches or zones of through-talic discontinuous permafrost in watersheds, and we'll feed that into the model. Thank you. Sorry for going over time, John. I mean, Jeff.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. Thank you very much, Cathy. We do have a few minutes for questions. We won't have a hard cutoff at the top of the hour, but I know we have a number of participants and there may be questions. So please type into the chat. I think that's the way we've managed these in previous weeks. And maybe just while we're waiting for 1 or 2 questions to appear, maybe Cathy, could you comment on non-precipitation event driven runoff? Meaning, permafrost thaw and linked to warm days, for instance, and observations of that in any of your catchments. This is something that colleagues I'm working with in China, in Tibet, talk a lot about, and I'm just wondering if you might comment on that.
Yeah, we haven't been focused as much on making those kinds of measurements across the rivers or streams in the area that would allow us to get at that. However, the modeling clearly that we've done where there is, as talic is forming, a big part of the increase in winter base flow that occurs in the model is actually the thawed zone of the talic. It's that water. It was ice. It's now, becoming liquid water and draining out through the now open pathway through the groundwater system into the stream. So we certainly in the models, we see that contribution in a big way. And certainly one of the things that we are doing is Brent Newman has started collecting samples around river systems in the Seward Peninsula between continuous and discontinuous permafrost, and looking at the geochemical signatures that might tell you how geochemical and hydrographic signatures that might tell you, what's going on in that respect, where that water's coming from.
Right. Not seeing any questions yet, but still hoping to see one or two in the chat. Perhaps you could just say if there's been any like Hillslope scale trenching work, for instance, if not in your area, other papers you're aware of in permafrost zones that have, tried to think about lateral flow in the subsurface and activation of that associated with thaw. Just briefly. Oh, I see questions coming in now.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that there are people who've done a lot of trenching to characterize the subsurface at Argonne National Lab, a kind of a companion project that was more focused on carbon redistribution in these ice wedge polygon. I know that there are some papers on it. I do want to say that while we haven't trenched yet, we did a tracer experiment in ice wedge polygons where we did quantify subsurface lateral flow and breakthrough of subsurface tracer out of polygon centers and through the subsurface to troughs without any overflow over the rims as
okay, interesting. Great.
Yeah.
Okay, got some questions here. Phil Marsh. Hi, Cathy. Very nice talk. Thanks. I'm interested on how your thinking has progressed on how you will incorporate your great high resolution process hydrology work into your climate model.
Yes, so through lots and lots of synthetic runs on watersheds that aren't necessarily exact representations of watersheds, but simplified representations of a whole range of different configurations of watersheds and permafrost and climate types. And then use those to start to come up with the parameter values that would go into, say, deep drainage is likely to be this value in this kind of watershed versus that value in another watershed. Those are the ways that we're going to feed it back into that ELM grid cell framework.
Right. And similar question from Martin. Martin Clark, have you synthesized your observations to a point where you can define specific test cases for land models, i.e. to evaluate if the land models represent the observed behavior?
Yes, in some cases we do have enough data to actually, and we've synthesized it to the point where it can be used, and it is being used on smaller patches though. So even when we're running ELM, the E3SM land model, we tend to run them on, I would say kilometers or a few kilometers or a kilometer sort of scale, not up at the full Pan-Arctic scale yet. We are not there yet. And there, we really need the community. We're going to need to really start integrating over these next few years of NGEE with the bigger community and the other data sets that are out there.
Good. There are one or two small questions, but I'm sensitive to time, and knowing that that your next event started 5 minutes ago. This is with the class, and there'll be a lot of students there eager to chat about not just your talk, but of course the paper you sent along that we've been looking at. So with that, Cathy, I'd like to thank you for really an illuminating talk and a great overview of the activities going on with the Los Alamos group. I want to remind our people that are listening to today's talk that next week is Deb Perrone. She's going to come to us from UC Santa Barbara, and it'll be a talk on groundwater, water security in the context of groundwater at largely the regional scale. So thank you again, Cathy, and we will see you momentarily on Zoom. And again, thanks everybody for tuning in today. All the best.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.